Hello, fellow 3D enthusiast. I just wanted to chat with you for a minute about our crazy situation that we're in with the pandemic and everything. And I also wanted to continue to help you learn Blender, so I'm just going to mash those into one video. So a little bit later in the video, I'm going to teach you some techniques that I use to take this render and turn it into this render. So stay tuned for that, or just skip ahead to this part of the video. So I don't necessarily know you personally, but there are a couple of guesses that I could make about you. One of them being you're probably interested in 3D and in Blender, and the other guess is you're probably on a spectrum, one end being aware of the pandemic we're in and not very affected, and the other end being severely affected by it. I have friends who are out of work and stuck at home, and most of us are stuck at home, so yeah, that's probably not news to you. Now, everybody is talking about this crazy thing, and I don't like being like everybody, so I just didn't talk about it for a long time, but that long time's over now. Now, the other thing everybody is doing is losing their minds about it and how this is going to be so terrible, and I'm not going to try and make light of that, but dude, as 3D artists, we have a huge opportunity here. So I guess all that is to say I just wanted to take a second and encourage you. If you're watching this and you're human, well, you're probably pretty complicated, but a lot of your time can be spent doing two things: consuming or creating. I'm not going to take a side and say one is better than the other. I think they're both super important. So just for a few examples, consuming could be things like watching movies or reading, and creating, well, how about making something in Blender? So yeah. They're both important, but at the moment I'm seeing an imbalance, at least in my life, where I spend way too much time consuming rather than creating. And consuming doesn't have to be bad. In fact, you're consuming right now, you're learning. Learning is so important. But when there's an imbalance, I don't know about you, but personally, I can feel really terrible when I spend all day consuming, and I never make anything. So here's the encouragement part. If you're a 3D artist and you're stuck at home and you don't have a job, you have so much time, and time is more valuable than money because you're never going to get that back. Now, I don't want to sound preachy or anything, I'm mostly talking to myself here, but I'm going to challenge you and myself to spend more time creating and less time consuming, because right now my metaphorical seesaw is way tipped towards consuming. And yet, we have all this time at our disposal at the moment, so let's use it wisely. I just inspired myself to go make a tutorial. Alright, so let's hop into the actual tutorial part of this video. I mentioned I would show you how I created this render from this render. And first of all, I'd like to mention, if your render looks like this, or if my render looks like this, we don't have to despair and think, well, this is the end of the line, this is terrible, it's gonna be awful, because I mean, this isn't perfect here, but we can build on top of it. And this was actually just kind of a rough stage. But that being said, we don't have to just leave it here. We can actually get pretty good results from something like that. So let's just talk about the differences here real quick. One of the biggest things that I've noticed with this scene that I just was not happy with was the ground and these really harsh lines here where you could see the stone obviously stops. So one of my solutions to fix that, it's kind of hard to see down here, but to add a little bit of high detail stone down there. And what I did for that was just to create a few very simple rock assets and just scatter them all along the seams there so it would look nicer. Another change I made, if you look closely here, this is the ground material here, and I just kind of matched up the colors of them a little bit better. And you can do that fairly easily in shading. If you take a look here at my other scene and we just render this, you can see really all I did to the material was add an RGB curves node and then just bump up the red because there was quite a bit of red in these rocks. And if we mute this, you can see it was a little bit more blue looking here. So really, just kind of matching up material colors was a huge advantage. And also in this scene, you can see the other assets I've put in. You can see the little rocks really well. And I've also added this light here, which, if we just hop back to the other scene, you can see this huge wall here was kind of boring, and just a giant part of the render that wasn't really helping the story or animation or anything like that. So what I've done in this is I just added a very simple point light, and I've animated some of the values. I've got power animated and radius animated. So in this scene, I thought that would just kind of help to add a bit more story. It's like somebody had a campfire going here or something like that, and there's actually a little bit more life in the scene. So speaking of life in the scene, obviously there's these plants as well. They're kind of growing up in the little crevice here, and that helped to kind of add a nice contrasting color, as well as, like I said, just a little bit more detail and life and interest in the scene. What I'd like to do in a second here is to show you how I created these assets down here, the simple rocks and the plants, and how I scattered them fairly specifically on the ground. So I'm going to hop over to my layout tab here, and I've got this pre-made scene, and I'm just going to kind of run you through all the settings on these assets, how I created them. These rocks are absolutely terrible. They're just basically cubes, and what I've done is I've just put a subdivision modifier on them, as well as a displace modifier. And the cool thing about this displace modifier, it's just a cloud texture that's working with the texture here, and I've set the texture coordinates to be global. So what makes that cool is when you grab them and move them around, the rocks procedurally change into a different rock. So you can literally have the same object, duplicate it, and you've got a different rock, which is super handy, super quick. It's a good way to make a lot of rocks really fast. And like I said, these are terrible. There's like shading issues with them, but they're good enough, and good enough is what we're going for. So a quick look over here at these plants. You can see it looks a little bit complex, but it's just a few elements that are duplicated and moved a little bit at a time. So how I started was I just had a plane, which I kind of tapered a little bit. If we go into edit mode, you can see here, yeah, there's some loop cuts. It's pretty simple. This is just what the model looks like without any modifiers enabled. And if we go into UV editing, you can see the texture I used here. Just took a picture of a plant and put that along that texture. So it's fairly simple stuff. Then what I did was add a subdivision surface modifier that kind of smoothed it out and made it look a little bit more organic. And then I added in a solidify modifier, which just made it look a little bit more thick. Then using proportional editing and duplicating, I just kind of took these and layered them on top of each other a little bit until I got something like this. And when I got something like this, I just kind of duplicated that into a few different segments, and I just created something like this. Now with this, we can duplicate it and get a few different variations, which is what you see here. So what you see in this process is really fairly simple. You just get one little building block, stack them together, and then duplicate them, and keep adding little variations, but once you get that set, you can really create a lot of stuff really quickly. Like these 3 variations took me about 5 minutes. Organic materials can be a tiny bit tricky, but this one actually came together fairly nicely. If we go into the shading tab, I can show you real quick what that looked like. So I mentioned we had the texture on that one little leaf there. You can see that here. This is just the raw texture. And what I did, really simple, I just got a hue saturation because I wanted it to look a little bit more dead and less vibrant, but I ran that into the base color of the principled node. And also, I fed this texture into a color ramp, cranked up white values, and put that into the roughness, just so it wasn't looking uniformly shiny. I also fed that into the height input on a bump node, and then just dropped that into the alpha. Another setting on the principled node was the subsurface, which is pretty important because light can actually pass through plants. They're not like a piece of metal. So when we turn up this, the light will actually kind of start to go through them. And I set my subsurface color to be kind of a green, so that when the light comes through, it kind of is a green color. And you can mess with this, make it look all sorts of crazy, but I think around here is probably good. Okay, so that is all of our assets all set. We've got these 3 little plants here, and these 4 stones here, which were literally just 1 stone duplicated 3 times. Now you might be asking how we scatter this. And the answer is the Scatter Objects add-on, which you can find in User Preferences, Add-ons, Scatter Objects. So this is completely free. It comes with Blender by default, so it's a really good, useful tool, and I highly recommend using it. And one of the big reasons I recommend it is, well, we could use particle systems. A lot of the time, particle systems are fairly fiddly and complex, but with the Scatter Objects add-on, you literally select the objects that you want to scatter, select the object you want to scatter them on, go space, or however you bring up your search function, and then just look up scatter, and you'll see scatter objects right here. Once you do that, you can just drag your mouse around on this plane, and it will literally scatter objects with the path, which is pretty sweet. So maybe this isn't perfect, it's not exactly how you wanted it. We can go into the little tool settings here, and object scatter settings are right here. We can turn up the density, so add a lot more or a lot less. We can turn up the radius, so how far away from the path they are. And we can turn up scale, scale randomness, and you can also mess with rotation if you like. But really, that's all you need to get a nice little scatter. And this add-on can be a little bit fiddly, but once you get the settings you like, you can hit enter, and that will scatter your objects on the plane. Now, one thing I don't like as much about this add-on is it creates a little collection of your assets and puts them right in the center of the world, which can sometimes be in the way. So if we want to kind of fix that, you can just grab your plane, move that up. We need to do that again. So that's something that you kind of learn eventually, is to not have your scene completely centered on the origin when you want to scatter something, because if it is, you'll get that issue. But we can really easily just do that again. These rocks are down here, they're not in our way, and these are nicely scattered up here. Okay, so that's pretty nice. Let's grab our plants, select all those, select our plane, scatter objects, draw a path, enter, and we have a bunch of plants. And this is a super easy process that you can do to any mesh. And if you look at this plane, it's only got 4 vertices. If we were going to try and use the particle system and have this much control over a specific area, we'd need to subdivide this and get kind of complicated. But with this add-on, it's super simple. So you might notice a few things like these being a little bit above the plane. We can just kind of grab them and drag them down. Let's just talk real quick about how to add just a little bit more life into your scene. Now, if you animate this and your camera is flying through here, one thing that you will notice, that I noticed in a previous test render, is it looks dead still, even though there's all these green growing plants all over the place. And the reason it looks so dead is because these things are stiff as a board. So I'm going to show you here how you can add a procedural wind animation to your plants once you add them in. We can select all of our plants, or try to. So with this, we'll go / on the number pad. So with all our plants here, I'm just going to hop real quick into weight paint mode. And with this, I'm just going to hit 1 on the number pad to go into front view. And there's this really cool tool here, which is the gradient tool. So what I'm going to do is just click at the top here and drag down, and that will add a gradient to our plant. And we want the bottom to be blue and the top to be red. And what this tells Blender is basically I want these top ones to be more affected by the wind than the base here, which is perfect. When I go back out of edit mode, I'm just going to hide this and then work through the rest of these plants. Okay, so all 3 of these have this weight paint map now. So what I'm going to do now is go into our modifiers and add a displace modifier. So with this modifier, everything gets crazy and blown out, but that's okay. Let's just hit this up arrow so that it goes up to the top of the modifier stack. And we can add a new texture. Let's hit this little setting here, and we can go image or movie, switch that to be clouds. Let's turn up the size a little bit. Okay. Now let's turn down the strength of this so it's not too crazy. And for vertex group, we're just going to put in group. And this is the group that we just painted. Nice. So this might be a little bit strong still. I'm going to turn the factor down. Maybe a 0.2 will work. So now we have this displace affecting the tips of this plant. Cool. Let's add in an empty real quick here. Plane axis will work. And what we want to do with this plant now is make it so that the texture coordinates are object. And I'm just going to hit that with the dropper tool. And now when we grab this, there's a bit of wind going on in the leaves. Now if we want this to be truly procedural, we can take our timeline here, split it, and get the graph editor. I'm going to hit N, and with this empty selected, I'm going to hit I, location. Then we have keyframes to work with here. I'm just going to put the wind on the X location, and if we go down to modifiers here, generator, that will add a curve, and this will just take off into the horizon. And it looks like this is in a tornado. So that's a little bit fast. If we just turn down the slope a little bit to something quite a bit more gradual, like a 0.01, you can see there's this really soft wind ambient animation. And it's all completely procedural, so that's pretty cool. Now you can edit the strength of this so it's affecting it less. You can edit the texture so that it's affecting the animation differently, so it's kind of a soft wind. And you can edit the speed of the wind, or the strength of the wind, basically. Okay, so this plant is all good. So for these plants, if we just select them, and then select this one last, and go Control L, we can make links to the modifiers. Now these will both have the same modifiers as this one. If we just go Alt-G, put that back in the center, you can see they've all got this really nice gradual wind animation going. And if we go back out of local view with the slash on the number pad, back to real life, and look up here, you can see all of our plants have this nice little wind animation. And it's not perfect, but it will really add a whole bunch more life to your scene. Alright, well that'll pretty much do it. Thanks for hanging out with me and just chatting a little bit. I know most of the time my videos are just kind of like, do this, do that, that's how you get that. But let me know in the comments if you liked it, didn't like it, whatever. And I'd just like to let you know that I care about you and I'm praying for you to make it through this. Other than that, I'll see you again real soon. Cheers!